Is free speech, even free speech that we might find incredibly difficult, still worth defending?
Free speech is the mechanism through which we defy tyranny and authority. I have defended people with whom I have strong disagreements. History has demonstrated that about the last entity that you want to trust to determine what is too dangerous for us to hear is the government. I had this sense of security that my community loved me. I had no idea how dramatically the community would turn.
Hello and welcome to The Sacred. My name is Elizabeth Oldfield, and this is a podcast about the deep values of a very wide range of guests who are shaping our common life. They come from all manner of political, metaphysical, and professional perspectives. And today's guest is David French. David is a New York Times columnist, a former civil liberties attorney, and we had an amazing conversation about being a conservative in the US right now. There's some reflections from me at the end, and I really hope you enjoy listening. David, I am going to ask you a question which you might not get asked every day, which is, what is sacred to you? And you can really take that in any direction that you like, but what I am kind of probing for is maybe if we bracket out our families, which I think are sacred to almost all of us. I'm looking for what are your deep principles and the things that have guided you that you've tried to live by?
It's a really good question, and I would say that the answer has changed over time. And I'm going to give you an answer, and it's going to sound big and broad, but it's actually narrower than you might think. And the answer is virtue. And so when I say that, what I mean by that is I read a fascinating book last year called The Pursuit of Happiness. It's by my friend Jeff Rosen, who runs the National Constitution Center here in the United States. And he wrote a book called The Pursuit of Happiness. And what he was looking at was that phrase from the American Declaration of Independence. It says, we're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And he was looking at that, and what does that mean? And what he found is that it does not mean the pursuit of pleasure. It does not mean the pursuit of wealth. It doesn't even mean the pursuit of happiness in the way that we think of happiness as joy. What it meant was the pursuit of virtue. And what was so important about that was how the pursuit of virtue was tied to the American experiment in a very specific way. And that in essence, what we have in this country is a social compact. And the social compact says this, that the government of the United States, its obligation is to protect liberty. But what is the obligation of the citizen? The obligation of the citizen is to exercise their their liberty in a virtuous manner. In other words, to go back to John Adams and his letter to the Massachusetts militia of around 1800 or so, he says, our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the governance of any other. And what does that have to do with the sacred? Well, what that has to do with the sacred is here you're talking about in American history, there's this understanding that virtue, and they would talk about classical virtues like Aristotelian virtues, including like courage and temperance and prudence, wisdom, things like that, with more expansive kinds of virtues, moving and merging in with Christian fruit of the Spirit from Galatians 5, that virtue was seen as indispensable to the American experiment. And then also when you extend that from sort of the political cultural realm, and you look at Scripture, and, I'm very deeply influenced by Paul in Galatians 5 when he talks about the works of the flesh versus fruit of the Spirit. And he's talking about the fruit of the Spirit as, this is the sign. These are the markers that demonstrate sort of like when you are in God's will, like when you are living the way that God wants you to live. And what is that marker? It's not a set of beliefs. It's not, belief in the resurrection, as important as that is. It's not belief in X or Y or Z, or it's not a belief in inerrancy, egalitarianism, complementarian, you name it. Reformed theology, Arminian theology, like all of these theological or ideological belief-based propositions. It's a set of virtues: kindness, peace, patience, gentleness, self-control. And that what we're finding now is that we're moving into a period in American history where we're trying to construct a republic and where virtue is frequently denigrated, is sort of seen as a fool's game. There was a a piece written in 2019 against me, about me, called Against David Frenchism. So it was kind of hard not to take it personally. And
yeah, I've read it.
And it talks about civility and decency as second-order values because there's bigger things. And so to blatantly rip off from my friend and colleague at the Dispatch, Jonah Goldberg, who said at the beginning of this particular miserable era in American politics and culture, character is destiny. And so for me, what I have learned is that I spent much of my life sort of taking virtue for granted, that there was a baseline of virtue, say in the church or in the culture, that I took for granted, that we had a kind of irreducible level of integrity, as imperfect as we were, in the church, in American politics. And now I see that has been shattered in many ways. And so we are now living in a post-virtue world. And so virtue has become more sacred to me. And by virtue, I mean classical virtues, biblical virtues of, the fruit of the Spirit, the classical Aristotelian virtues. And those things, I think we're having to relearn that they are indispensable to human flourishing.
And can you think of a time in your life where that has been under pressure, where you have faced a choice to either act virtuously or turn yourself towards virtue or not to? And if it's not too painful and personal, would you tell us about it?
Yeah, it's funny. I have been thinking a lot about this because I've begun to realize a sort of a fundamental truth about human nature. And this is rooted in a C.S. Lewis quote that I think is so true and wise. He says, courage is not just one virtue, but it is the form of every virtue at its testing point. And so what this means is, for example, you don't know if you're honest truly until honesty carries a cost. You don't know if you're physically brave truly until you actually have to risk your life and limb. You don't know if you're a faithful spouse or boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever until you are tempted towards infidelity. That we live our lives often with this sort of self-conception that we are a certain kind of person. And then as we walk through life, that self-conception is put to the test time and time again. And sometimes we fail and sometimes we succeed. But what I can think of several points in the last 10 years or so where I had to face a choice where if I say, for example, I'm a longtime civil liberties lawyer, I've defended people across the political spectrum. But sometimes being dedicated to the principle of free speech means I'm going to defend somebody that I really disagree with. And not only somebody that I really disagree with, but the act of defending them will cause me an enormous amount of grief in my own community, in my own home, not my home, but in my home community, in my home church. And those have been testing points for me, where what is my commitment to my principle here? And so I think the last 10 years, I have seen more tests arrive in rapid fire to my underlying principles than any time in my life previously. I did not realize how easy I had it before the last 10 years, that I was in a church that I seemed to fit like a glove. I was very politically conservative in a very politically conservative church. I was very Republican in a very Republican church. And so everything fit. And then I realized that my commitment to my principles meant that I couldn't be Republican anymore. What would that mean? What would that mean for my relationships? What would that mean for my church family and my community? And so I've been through a number of these tests, these tension points over the years, and over especially the last 10 years. And, overall, I feel like I have imperfectly upheld my principles, but I have been very conscious of the testing, just very conscious. And I think that being conscious of the testing helps us survive the testing. It's when we're caught by surprise or when we are confronted with something that we did not anticipate or didn't have a strong foundation for addressing, that we often, that's when we often kind of get caught up in that maelstrom.
Yeah. It's one of the reasons, we've been going since 2017, and at least one of the things this podcast is trying to do is force people in public life to think about their deep values, because it's remarkable how easy it is, depending on what your communities of moral formation have been in, or your formation more generally, or the education system you've been through, to just have like an ambient hunch about what a good person is that's completely unexamined. And then when these moments, that call for moral courage come, to actually not know like what compromise is, or what, and drip, like, and end up at the end of your life not someone who you ever set out to be. And I find it very illuminating to continually go back to, okay, what are my values and what do I want to stand for, so that when I am called to stand for them,
well, and
I don't have to decide at that point.
I have a couple of advantages in approaching this. One is my parents. They were people and are people who have lived their values. In other words, when they have been tested, I watched them. I watched them rise to the occasion. When my dad's integrity was put to the test, I watched him rise to the occasion. And so I had a parental model for rising to the occasion when values are put to the test that made me want to be that person, to live up to that example. That's a huge advantage in life. I mean, I don't even know, there are a lot of people of very, very high integrity I know who have come from much more difficult backgrounds and life experiences than me. And I just admire the heck out of those people, because I had a giant advantage. For me, the actual path of least resistance growing up was imitating my dad. And my dad would stand up for his values. My dad was, and my mom too, they were both like that. And then also I kind of have this historical haunting, if that makes sense. I come from the South, the American South. I was born in Alabama, raised in Tennessee, Louisiana, Tennessee, and Kentucky. So I'm a true son of the South. And if you go back in my family tree, all of my ancestors wore gray. They were Confederates. So they were on the wrong side of the American Civil War. And I've always, ever since I began to come of age and began to learn more about the Civil War and what it was actually about, and not the kind of the mythology of it I was taught when I was a kid in the South, I've had this question: what would I have done in 1861? Would I have been a Stonewall Jackson, who was a Confederate general who, when Virginia was going to be invaded, he decided he was going to stand with the state and defend, slavery and the Confederacy? Or would I be a George Thomas, who is also a Virginian, who, when the war started, decided he was going to stand against slavery and for union and defy his whole community and defy much of his family? And so I've always had this thought of, okay, if my community is saying go one way and truth and my values are saying go another way, would I have the ability to do that? Would I have the fortitude to do that? And that's something that I've actually thought a lot about in my life. And so in some ways, understanding my own family history, and I'm not going to compare what's happening right now to the American Civil War, where something like slavery was at stake, but I will say that I am in an environment now where the vast bulk of my community is going in a direction that I believe is very wrong, woefully wrong, harmfully wrong. And in that circumstance, it is actually more difficult than you might think. It's more painful than you might think to go against your own community and to push against your own community.
Yeah. And we'll come to your experience of that in a bit. But I want to give me a sense of like the big formative ideas in your childhood. And I kind of, bear in mind that a lot of our listeners are British. Mm-hmm. What did life look like? Say you're 8 years old.
Yeah.
What does your community look like? What does, I assume, church look like? How does the politics that you were raised in show up in your life?
Well, that's so funny that you chose 8 years old, because that was actually in my family's life a very, very, that year was a very pivotal time in our family's life, because my dad was confronted with a moral crisis at work where he was essentially told to keep silent, to not speak about some corruption that he had seen.
What did he do?
He was a professor at a university.
Right.
Or a college, small Christian college, and had seen some things that were wrong, that the administration was involved. I don't know all the details because I was so young when it happened. But he was basically given a choice, silence and keep a job, or speak and lose a job. And he chose to speak. And he lost a job with a young family. I was very young. My sister was younger than me, with no other job. And so he stood up at that point in time on principle of truth, and it cost him a job when he had no other job and a young family. I mean, that's a crisis. That is by God's grace, he found another job. It was hard. It took time. But the community that I grew up at that time was a very closed fundamentalist community. As my friend from the Trinity Forum, Sheree Harder, says, we did not put the fun in fundamentalism. And so this was, in the mid-'70s, so it's before the rise of the Christian right and the religious right. And so there was less of the political unanimity and uniformity than I became accustomed to later in my life. But there was an enormous amount of theological uniformity, enormous amount of legalism, very little tolerance for disagreement, very little tolerance for dissent. And so my parents, in many ways, even though they grew up in that tradition, were countercultural within the tradition. So the tradition was legalistic. They were not legalistic. The tradition was very judgmental. They lived lives full of grace. And so they're countercultural within our own community. And so that kind of created an inherent tension in our lives. We were part of a community. We were part of a community that we didn't entirely fit into, if that makes sense. And so this was very important to my formative years. It taught me that it is okay to disagree, that it is okay to say no when other people are saying yes, or to say yes when other people are saying no. And so for me, that was very, very formative. But I was also growing up with this sort of dualistic view of the Christian faith, where the faith that I saw at home was wonderful and rich and full of love and grace. And then the faith that I saw at church was narrow and constricted and intolerant and exceedingly prideful and exceedingly judgmental. Now, that's not to say that that was the way all of the people were at the church. There were some wonderful people there. Wonderful. You can go to the most fundamentalist church you can find, and you will find in that place some wonderful people. You will. But the culture of the institution was something extremely intolerant and often kind of angry and defiant. And so I grew up with that tension my whole life. And it was only later when I became an adult and I left home that I left that tradition almost entirely and moved into what you might call a more traditionally evangelical tradition than the more narrow fundamentalist one I grew up in.
Yeah. And you said that you were most of your life a Republican. Would you still call yourself a conservative?
Very much so. Yes, absolutely.
So tell me about coming to political awareness and some of those values, and what was drawing you? I guess more simply, why did you become a conservative?
Well, first you have to understand you're talking to a ridiculous nerd. Okay, so when a bunch of other kids at 9 or 10 years old are, playing with action figures, I was certainly doing that. Make no mistake. I had Han Solo and Luke Skywalker and all of it. I had the Millennium Falcon and I had all of that. But I was also reading the newspaper from cover to cover. We had these World Book encyclopedias, and there's pictures my parents have of me as a young kid, sitting on the floor with a crescent moon of encyclopedias around me as I'm just reading an entry and going to another one and going to another one. So I became unusually politically aware really by the time I was 11 or 12 years old. And so I'm coming of age right at the beginning of the Reagan era. And the number one issue at that time was the confrontation with the Soviet Union. And so I was a Cold War kid. I I told you I was a nerd. I'm going to prove it. I would consistently buy big coffee table books about the balance of power between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And so I would have these giant illustrated books about the balance of power between the two sides. I would read history books. I was obsessed with military history. And so I came of age essentially a Reagan Republican because I saw the Republican Party as a bulwark against Soviet aggression. And that was the prime mover for me. And then as I got older and I became aware of issues like abortion, for example, I became pro-life, especially, I was deeply influenced in that by Pope John Paul II and his gospel of life. But I was originally a Republican because of the Cold War. And that's the shortest and most direct answer.
Okay, that's really helpful to understand. I'm so fascinated by how, I think there's just a temperament thing, there's a context thing that leads people to their political intuitions. But certainly a lot of the conservatives I speak to in the UK have often a radical Marxist face. Conservatism in the UK is a thing that you come to, many people come to after they have had a very kind of idealist utopian left-wing thing. But that has, you've never flirted. You've never had a crisis of faith in conservatism.
Never, because I'm focused so much on the Cold War, and Marxism and communism are utopian ideologies. And so I saw the danger of the utopian ideology very, very early in life. And so I was always much more libertarian. My youthful idealism was always oriented more towards libertarianism than communism or Marxism. Can you just
define that for people who don't know what it means?
Yeah, so libertarianism is essentially an ideology that puts that the best way to the way to think about it is that government power is, especially government power over the individual, is inherently suspect. Government central planning is inherently suspect. Not simply because, but in part because there is a long record of, for example, government central planning not failing time and time again. How many 5-year plans did we see out of the Soviet Union, for example, that failed miserably? How much economic stagnation have we seen in socialist countries? That central planning is just inferior to the market for human flourishing and prosperity. And so, not that the market should be completely the jungle, totally unregulated. I mean, some what you might call minarchist libertarians would say, no regulation of any kind, this close to anarchy. No, but the default is the government really has to justify itself if it's going to infringe upon that sort of zone of a private autonomy. And so there's this, and libertarianism, interestingly enough, has some utopian elements to it. As a friend of mine said, libertarianism only works in libertopia. But it's not that is libertarianism a sort of a holistic, idealistic worldview, but it's more of a preference. It's an inclination. It's a disposition that says government power has to justify itself. And that would be a fundamental principle, that if you're going to explain that I am introducing government power into situation A, B, C, D, you got to bear a burden of proof to show that government power is going to be appropriately exercised, is going to improve the situation, is going to be a preferable outcome, et cetera. And so, for example, it's very easy to say that the government power is necessary to create national defense. That would be very easy. Government power being exercised to determine, for example, who can cut hair or not cut hair, or who can, do a tattoo or not do it. Now you're getting a little bit more attenuated. Why are you getting there? And there's a lot of, room in between. But my youthful and also adult inclination is far more libertarian than it is any other ideological view.
Mm. So maybe if I asked a pure libertarian, maybe if I asked libertarianism what is sacred, it would say kind of the autonomy of the individual.
Liberty, yeah.
Liberty.
Yeah, individual liberty,
okay.
yeah.
And conservatism is related to libertarianism, or can be, but there are more and less libertarian forms of conservatism. How would you define the conservatism that you hold?
Yeah, so the conservatism that I hold to has been traditionally called Reagan conservatism, and it tends to have three elements. So one element, social conservatism, is where Reagan conservatism tends to depart from pure libertarianism. So in other words, Reagan conservatism is pro-life. A lot of libertarians are pure libertarians.
So you would say not like the freedom of the individual over their reproductive rights. There's a limit to that.
There's a limit. You cannot. And now many libertarians are pro-life and along the grounds that I say that my liberty ends where yours begins. And so if I don't have the freedom to take another life. And so abortion is the taking of a life, in my view. And so my liberty does not extend to extinguishing somebody else's life. And so there's a libertarian argument for the pro-life position. But a lot of libertarians just don't buy that. They say this is bodily autonomy. But so the Reagan conservatism had these three prongs: social conservatism, which was primarily manifested through a pro-life legal approach, economic conservatism, which is where you much more see the libertarian inflection. That is less regulation, a less onerous state involvement in the economy, a less onerous state presence in your personal life, a greater zone of liberty and authority in the economic sphere. And then the final prong was directly related to the Cold War element, which was a strong national defense centered around forward deployments and international alliances. So you would find no greater champion of NATO, for example, than a Reagan conservative. Reagan conservatives were the furthest thing from isolationists. They were free trade. They were internationalists. They were what you would call a globalist now. But so those were the three prongs of conservatism. And the reason why I say I'm still very much a conservative is I still adhere to each one of those three prongs, whereas the current Republican Party denies all three. Now, they will say that we're still pro-life, but the Republican platform is not pro-life. It is definitely not economically conservative or libertarian anymore. And it is much more, isolationist isn't the wrong word, but it is much more a sphere of influence related international worldview than it is the kind of internationalist worldview that came out of the conservative movement originally.
Yeah, thank you. So you are this nerdy kid,
yes,
with your coffee table books,
yes,
instinctive libertarian conservatism, and then you become a lawyer and start doing civil liberty defense work. Is that right?
I start being a professional libertarian, Elizabeth. I start defending individual liberty, the Bill of Rights, mainly free speech, mainly religious freedom, but also due process. And I did that for many years.
And then there's this move where you become slightly more of a commentator, and then the president, I think, of FIRE, which is could you tell me what it stands for? Yeah.
Well, FIRE, when I became the president, was the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. And so we were a civil liberties organization that was defending free speech rights and due process rights and religious freedom on college campuses across the country, whether you were right, left, middle, it didn't matter. Whatever point of view you had, if you had a free speech claim, we would help you. It is now the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, and it does work more than on campus, but the same principle. If your free speech rights are violated, doesn't matter if you're left or you're right, we're going to defend you. And so my actual progression was I started as a big law firm lawyer doing commercial litigation, like big contract cases between large companies. And I did First Amendment work pro bono on the side. And then I started to do so much of that by the early 2000s, I switched over to doing First Amendment work full time. That's when I joined FIRE. And then I became a journalist more than 10 years after that, when my First Amendment work had become so much a part of my life that I was also writing about it an awful lot in publications. And I just kind of naturally eased out of law practice into writing about the Constitution and politics, et cetera.
And I've heard you say that you got so frustrated with how the media was covering a lot of these cases that you were just like, someone needs to come and set the record straight.
Yes.
Which you've made a very successful career out of. I feel like asking you to do this briefly is really unfair. But there will be listeners who, their association with people who are spending their whole life defending religious freedom and defending freedom of speech, the shorthand in some listeners' heads will be people who defend people who are hateful.
Sometimes. Sometimes. Absolutely. Yeah.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
And the conversations about free speech have changed and moved so much over the last decade or so, and how we think about harm and why for you, and I think this is still the case, is free speech, even free speech that we might find incredibly difficult and that many people will certainly experience themselves as harmed by, still worth defending?
You know, I can do no better than refer listeners to an 1860 essay by Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist. And so Frederick Douglass, in 1859, he was speaking at an event, an abolitionist event in Boston, which was considered at the time sort of like the epicenter of American abolitionism. But he
was a slave himself, right? I think.
Yes, former slave himself. And so he's speaking in favor of abolition. He's, probably with Lincoln and Douglas are like the Washington and Jefferson of the second founding. I mean, as far as like an intellectual architect of the second founding, the post-Civil War founding of the United States. So he's speaking in 1859, and a mob shuts down his speech. A pro-slavery mob shuts down his speech. So in 1860, he writes an essay called A Plea for Free Speech in Boston. And it is the most powerful and effective short argument for free speech you will read in the English language. And he makes a few points that I think are very salient. Number one, he calls free speech the great moral renovator of society and government. And he also says that it is the dread of tyrants. Okay, so free speech is the mechanism through which we engage in moral renovation of society. And free speech is the mechanism through which we defy tyranny and authority. And so he talks about free speech as the first right that a tyrant will seek to extinguish. And you see this around the world. I mean, try raising a peep of protest about Putin's invasion of Ukraine in Russia right now. See what happens to you. And so one of the natural responses is when people hear that, they go, I totally agree with that. I'm all for his abolitionist speech. That's great speech to protect. But what they forget is that abolitionist speech at that time was deemed to be deeply offensive and harmful. Harmful, Elizabeth. If you go back and you read some of the arguments in the antebellum South, they will use arguments against free speech that are very reminiscent of the arguments against free speech you'll hear on college campuses, that free speech causes mental and psychological discomfort, that it harms the people who are the targets of it. And so time and time again, you have a situation where people will say, I'm for free speech, but, and the only words that matter are the words after the but, because once you say I'm for free speech, but, you're going to invariably start carving out a lot of exceptions that sort of rely on you to be the determiner of what is worth hearing and what is not worth hearing. And in the United States, our law is pretty explicit that that's not the role of the government. That, yeah, we fully acknowledge that there's horrible and hateful speech out there. But what we don't do is give the government the authority to say what is too horrible or hateful to express. And because if we gave the government that authority, it would have, history teaches us, have suppressed an awful lot of speech that we now value greatly, on the grounds that it was horrible and hateful. We do things in the free speech community in the U.S. like even defend the rights of Nazis to march through a town peacefully. We defend the rights of people to say things that are extremely offensive. I have defended people that with whom I have strong disagreements. But the reason is rooted in this fundamental notion that free speech is the great moral renovator of society and government. It is the dread of tyrants. And that history has demonstrated with just crystal clarity that about the last entity that you want to trust to determine what is too dangerous for us to hear or too harmful for us to hear is the government.
That's really helpful because I and the trouble with doing this podcast is I listen to people from such wildly different perspectives that I end up not really having any idea what
I understand. Yeah.
But the free speech one I've found particularly difficult to navigate because the bad arguments for free speech are often there's no such thing as psychological harm. Like you basically suck it up. Unless it's hurting unless it is actually violent, there is no, like the sticks and stones can't break your bones thing, which is clearly, from what we know, from all of the psychological literature, just not true, right? Argue with me in a minute if you want.
No. I was going to agree with you because I support free speech because it is so potent, not because it is harmless, but because it is so potent. You know, I believe the pen is ultimately mightier than the sword. And so I don't protect free speech because it's minimally important.
Because it doesn't hurt anyone.
Yeah, I support free speech because it's maximally important. So I fully recognize that people can experience extreme mental distress in the face of free speech. Absolutely understand that. But at the same time, the cost of suppressing that speech is extremely high and harmful ultimately to human rights and human dignity.
Yeah, so that's really helpful to me to hear that there's like a balancing of goods and a balancing of harms, and that the kind of broader, longer-term common good effect of suppressing speech is the greater evil.
Yes.
Is what I'm hearing. Okay, that's really helpful for me. So you are doing this kind of work at Fire as a lawyer, and then for a while you went and served in the army.
Yeah.
What led to that decision?
Well, that's a good question. I did that for a very simple reason, and that is I could not continue to support the Iraq War if I did not serve in Iraq. I just felt a sense of conviction on that. And it arose out of, I remember I was reading a newspaper article, and this was in 2005 when the war was at its worst point. And the Army was having trouble recruiting, falling well short of the recruiting shortfalls. Casualty rates were high. I mean, by Iraq War standards, not by Ukraine War standards, but by Iraq War standards. And it was a very tough time. And I just felt this burning sense of conviction that why was I exempt? There were reasons. I was 36 years old. I had 2 young kids. I had a good job. But, I read an article about a Marine major who was injured, and he calls home to his wife and 2 children on a reporter's satellite phone to tell them he was hurt, but he was going to be okay. And I thought, he doesn't love his wife less than I love my wife. He doesn't love his kids less than I love my kids, but he's putting his money where his mouth is and actually defending this country. And so I just felt an incredibly powerful conviction that this had to happen. I had to do it. And my wife, Nancy, she came on board as well. I mean, it was through a really interesting conversation with my son where he's very young at this point. So this is 2005. He's 4, almost 5 years old at this point. And they're walking through Philadelphia where we lived. I was president of Fire at that point, and he sees Independence Hall and the statues and everything. He's asking about these people. And my wife says, well, they're the founders of our country. That didn't help. And she said, well, they were farmers, they were pastors, they were soldiers, they were diplomats, they were politicians, but they were all patriots. And so my son turns to her and says, what's a patriot? And Nancy says, with this just great definition, she says, a patriot is somebody who loves this country more than they love themselves. And then my son asked the next question, are we patriots? And she kind of got choked up in that moment. And she said, yeah, we are. And so I didn't know this conversation happened. I come home, I'm ready to argue. Let me do this. And she's waiting for me and she says, do this. And then I said, well, if I do it, I'm going to go to Iraq. And she said, go to Iraq. And so I walked down to a recruiting office, this 36-year-old lawyer, not in good shape, bald as I am today. And I was like, I'm here to sign up for the JAG Corps Army lawyer. And they didn't know what to do with me. They just sent me to get a physical in Fort Dix, New Jersey. And then the rest was just up to me to figure out how to make it happen. But the next year I was in basic training in Fort Lee, Virginia. And the year after that, I was in Iraq with the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment in Diyala Province during the surge.
And how did it change you?
Oh, so many ways. I mean, Nancy will say that I am a different human being from before the war and after the war. It's hard to even sort of categorize all the different ways that it changes you. I think I would say that I'm a better person and a worse person in some ways. I think I'm a better person in the sense that I think that the whole experience humbled me a great deal. The whole experience taught me about the contingency of life. It taught me about the value of life. It was a very difficult deployment. We lost, we had I was with a squadron, an armored cavalry squadron that had about 800 guys. And we had of that 800, around 100 were killed or injured out of the 800. At one point, our small unit of 800 people was responsible for about 15% of the total casualties, American casualties in Iraq in the months of March and April of 2008. It was horrific. I mean, so I have a totally different outlook on life, a totally different outlook on death. I have a totally different appreciation on the fragility of life, the value of life. I'm much more humbled about the world, about our capacity to change the world. There's just a lot of things. We could do the hour on it. And then in other ways, I feel like I may be a worse person in some respects. And I have to check myself in that. And one of the areas is I feel like I might be an angrier person after Iraq than before Iraq. And I think that would be a primary change. Now, I know that, anger by itself is not a sin. I mean, Scripture says, be angry and do not sin. But I think anger creates temptation in a way that other emotions do not. And so, it absolutely deeply impacted me. I will never forget the very first night I landed. Our helicopter lands. I was a reserve officer assigned to an active duty unit. So listeners who are familiar with the military know that active duty soldiers don't necessarily love reserve soldiers until the reserve soldier can demonstrate that they're like proficient, And so at first I was just called lawyer until they liked me and then they used my name. But I'll never forget the first night I'm there, one of the troop commanders puts his arm around me because he could see like my eyes were as big as saucers. It was an intimidating experience, and he puts his arm around me. He says, lawyer, if you live through this, this is the most important year of your life. And all I heard in the moment was, if you live through this. But the second part was true. It was the most important year of my life. And it wasn't just for me. It was also an incredibly important year for my wife, for my children. And so, I think almost anyone who deploys and serves in a war zone will say, I don't know everyone, but I think most people would say there are two versions of me. The version of me that existed before the war and the version of me that exists after the war. And those are not two entirely separate people, but they are different people.
Does it still feel like the right thing?
100%.
Could go back.
100%. There are very few decisions in life that I have zero regret about. Marrying my wife, having my children, joining the army and going to Iraq. All of those things I have zero sense. I have absolute conviction that I did the right thing.
And so we come to this, I can't really put my finger on exactly where it starts, but one day you were the darling of the Conservative Party, the Republican Party, the conservative world. You were a vet, which feels like it's a kind of sacred thing in the US. In a way, it's definitely not in the UK. So was Nancy. Nancy's ghostwriting for all these conservative writers. You won awards. And then something starts to change. to the point you are now. Could you say maybe the moment when you realized that, you talked about having a sense of deep belonging and congruence with your church and deep belonging and congruence with your political party. What was the shift? Was there a particular time that led to where you are now?
Nothing gradual about it, Elizabeth. It was immediate and it was sudden. And it was, so in late 2015, so Trump had come down the escalator in 2015 in June. And at first, I was at that time, I had just started writing for National Review, really the premier conservative intellectual magazine in the US. And I was very happy to do it. I was, just felt very honored that I was being able to do it and very happy about it. And Trump comes down the escalator, and internally at NR, we were all just like, what's this guy doing? He's not conservative. And conservatism at that time really was centered around two elements. One was the ideological element that I talked about, the three-legged stool, but the other one was a character element and this really came out as a result of the Clinton administration and all of Clinton's scandals. And conservatives kind of really pushed themselves out in opposition to Clinton, say, you can have peace and prosperity, but if you have low character leadership, it's going to degrade our nation. And so the conservative movement early on was very centered around personal character. So Trump wasn't conservative ideologically. He had terrible personal character. And so I, along with a lot of other people in NR, were just kind of discounting him. What appeal is he going to have? On what grounds does he appeal? And then he kept appealing. And he's kept magnifying his appeal. And then he starts to win some primaries. And at that point, you realize, okay, this guy could win the nomination. This guy could become the GOP standard bearer. This guy could completely, radically transform the conservative movement. And so I can't remember if it's February 2016. I was never for him, and I can't remember if it's February or March of 2016. I just said, I'm never going to be for him. In other words, it's not that he's my last choice amongst Republicans. It's just that I'll never be with him. And that's the never Trump movement. And when I wrote that and I declared that I was never Trump, I did not think in a million years it would lead to my being alienated from church, from community, et cetera. Because as you said, my experience in my church was love. I'm a evangelical Christian, religious liberty, pro-life attorney veteran. Like that is the bio, right? You're introduced and people applaud you just for your bio, and at that point. And so I had this sense of security that my community loved me. And I didn't have this sense that I had some sort of big audience that I would do this and people would follow me. But I thought I would do this and people would at least still love and respect me. And my close friends, yes. My close friends, absolutely. But I had no idea. How dramatically the community would turn. And it's not everybody. When I say the community would turn, what I mean is that minority of people in a congregation who are extremely, extremely politically active and vocal turned on me viciously. And the majority of the congregation just sort of stayed out of it. So your experience is you have a small core of close friends who are with you through thick and thin. But then when you go to church, you never know in any given day if you're going to face somebody hostile, insulting you, attacking you. I mean, we'd had people approach us at communion, for example, at church. And so it just created a situation where my kids' Christian school, my church, you just couldn't count on it feeling like home anymore. And it wasn't gradual, Elizabeth, it was sudden. And it came along with an awful lot of death threats and online harassment. And that only magnified it. It's not that my members of my congregation were engaging in death threats, but they knew about the threats. They knew, and rather than rally to my side, they were still just angry about me not being Republican, about not voting for Trump. And that, in a way, that actually hurt worse than the threats. Because you expect there to be weirdos and wackos and evil people out there. You expect fringe elements. But what you don't expect is for people to see the fringe elements and do nothing at all to combat them and just let them run wild. And that's what you began to see in American churches.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've been reading a bit about your story and Nancy's story as someone who experienced abuse in her childhood and has been standing up against abuse in churches, and the sheer vile, racist, sexist, heinous, relentless abuse you have all received, and having, threats on your life and the police getting involved for years and years.
Yeah.
Whenever I've heard you speak or had a conversation with you, you present as someone with such calm and such sort of relentless jolliness. But I can't imagine that this experience, I kind of want to ask the same experience I did about your time in Iraq. Like, how has this experience of being rejected by the community of the people you actually know, and then rejected and attacked so roundly and repeatedly by a group of people that you thought believed similar things to you?
Well, the attacks on my wife and children have made me very, very angry. And we're talking about racist attacks on my youngest daughter, who is adopted from Ethiopia. We've talked about slander and defamation against my wife, threats against my wife. We've had awful, awful, scary moments. Things like somebody sending my son a direct message that's 3 Klan hoods. And then every few minutes, a new message, like with a picture of a street sign closer to and closer to our house, like they're coming for us. And so that stuff just makes me incredibly angry. And then what actually in an interesting way makes me even angrier is you will explain what's happened publicly and people don't want to hear it, right? They don't want to hear it. They'll say, shut up about it. You're not a victim, et cetera, the MAGA people. And then a lot of the non-MAGA Christians, it's just like they cover their ears. They can't deal with the implications of the fact that they're supporting a man who is so toxic and whose core supporters are so toxic that basically anyone who has a public platform who opposes him is going to have some version of our story. Threats against members of Congress have skyrocketed. Threats against election workers have skyrocketed. Threats against school board members have skyrocketed in this country. And there's Christians who don't want to hear about this. It's just like, stop, I don't want to hear it. And in some ways, that's even more painful than the actual threats themselves. It'd be one thing, because you can intellectually know that some percentage of people are going to be unhinged or disturbed. And that if you are in the public eye to some degree, you're going to attract their attention in a way that you don't when you're not a public figure. You can get this intellectually. But the thing that is so hurtful is that the big bulk of Christians are just totally passive in the face of this, just totally passive. But worse than passive, totally passive in responding to the threats, but active in maintaining and sustaining the movement that is spawning the threats. And that just makes it that much more painful.
So I have spoken to people who have come from all different perspectives and have moved between lots of different perspectives. And I think I have observed that when someone who's might have found their home on the left or in more progressive moments has, and this is all the language is contested, but has an experience where they might self-describe as being cancelled, like
right.
being exiled, really similar to what you experienced, being exiled from their community. They often leave that community, right? And I would say quite a lot of the most platformed or visible commentators in some bits of the right, and again, none of this language really works, are people who have felt ejected or exiled
I'm tracking.
from the left. I mean, you had this strange experience where most of your career you were being like picketed and threatened by the left, right? Because you have traditional views on sexuality, you were defending religious freedom, you're not a stranger to abuse and criticism. But that there's, I imagine, and I think the research shows it's a very different thing to be critiqued by people that we already disagree with. The experience of it is very different from being critiqued and attacked by people whose opinions we care about and that we felt that we belong to. A lot of the effect on the spiritual landscape of the last 10 years seems to me in the US that a lot of people have been leaving churches because they're so put off by this seeming mismatch between the kind of ethic of Jesus Christ and the political expression of it. But you have neither lost your faith nor stopped being a conservative.
Right.
In that you haven't done that trajectory of going into the arms of another community. Why do you think that is?
Well, that's a very good reason. And the reason is I don't want to be reactive. So in other words, what ends up happening is when you have negative experiences, and we've seen this, you become, let's put this in very simplistic terms, but it will help. Okay, so we tend to have two extremes in American life right now. You would call them the woke and the anti-woke. And what you'll notice is the anti-woke define themselves as against the woke, right? And so a lot of people have had very negative experiences with the far left. That's the canceling. And so what do? They run often to the other extreme, to the people who they see as most powerful or most affecting at combating the awful people who just canceled them. Now, that's a very human response, right? That's very human. We need community. We need people in our lives who are going to accept us and love us. And if you've been rejected by the left and the left hates you, you're going to find a home on the right. They're going to love you. When you come in across and you say the left is awful and horrible and terrible, they're going to love you on the right. But the problem
we know, we've been saying this all along.
Yeah, exactly. Welcome, friend.
Yeah.
And so you have this real temptation that exists to sort of say, okay, they're terrible. So what my right thing to do is to be anti the terrible people. Well, but the problem is you're not, even then, you're giving that other side control over your mind and heart. It's just an oppositional. Whatever they do, you're against, right? And it creates this oppositional dynamic that isn't truth-seeking, it's reactive, okay? And because what you've done is you've said these people are so terrible that whatever they're for has to be wrong. And so I'm right by just opposing them. And you see that going in both directions. It's one of the reasons why some of our politics are so volatile. So, for example, I've always been a free trade person, always. Well, now the Democrats are really free trade. Why? Did they have some revelation? No. It's that the Republicans were against free trade. And so that negative polarization pops in. It's a huge temptation to be reactive like that. But I do not think it leads to truth. And so what I have tried to do is stay true to the values that I think are true and stay connected to principles more than tribes. And that was always my understanding of what politics should be, is that you should be attached to principles and you choose your tribe based on which tribe best, though imperfectly, advances your principles. But now what we're seeing is that the principles are variable, but the tribe is fixed. And so you have to decide which tribe. And I just reject that choice. And so it's funny. So the result is a kind of this weird dichotomy where the far right says, oh, he's such a grifter. Look, he's enjoying the applause of, his left-wing masters at the New York Times. And the far left is furious at the New York Times for hiring me and actually protested hiring me, And so that, what I would say, and when our ideologies are in such a state of flux in this country, there's such a political realignment. If you find yourself fitting like a glove in either one of these two political parties right now, I would urge you to ask yourself, am I principles focused or tribe focused? Because I think if you're fitting like a glove in one of the parties, you're going to actually be more tribe focused than principle focused.
Principles over tribes. That feels like a very good place to end our conversation. David French, thank you so much for speaking to me today on The Sacred.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Well, David's sacred value was virtue, and he used other language around this character, this sense of how we are in the world being maybe more important than the positions we in theory ascribe to. And he was obviously setting that in his particular faith context in terms of maybe an over focus on, can you tick the boxes for the right being more important as a signifier of whether you're doing this thing right, in his case, Christianity, rather than kind of who are you and how are you treating others? And are you brave? And are you honest? And are you kind? And it does seem to me to be quite a deep difference for some people, that the way you are in the world and how you treat other people, for some people, is kind of the fundamental of the ethical and moral life, the fundamental of the good life. And for other people is slightly a side issue, it's tactics, but it's not strategy. It's the window dressing, not the real thing, that what you believe and what you do maybe are the fundamentals of what makes a good person and what a good life is, depending on, your own particular criteria for that. So that seems to be like one of the big differences between, say, David French and Sohrab Ahmari, who's the political commentator who wrote against David Frenchism. They're both conservatives, they're both Christians, but they really deeply disagree about how much it matters how you treat people that you disagree with. Courage is the form of every virtue at its testing point. Feels to me like quite an important thing to remember. We can have all these really theoretical values, but I guess the test is, do we live them when we're under pressure? Do we live them when there is a cost? Which feels like it was a real theme of this conversation. So I realised partly way through this conversation that it was, as the best of these interviews do, really pressing on some of my prejudices or surfacing some of my prejudices, which is basically that like civil liberties lawyers / freedom of speech lawyers would be, the kind of polite American version is a-holes. I just have a mental picture of the people who are up there defending either people who've said deeply offensive things to other people in public, or kind of taken actions that other people find heinous, not from whatever tribe really, the kind of theory of change that draws people to a kind of legal battleground as a way of engaging in our public life is just frankly so alien to me as a set of interests. And the deeply adversarial nature of those kind of legal encounters, and I guess just like cultural representations in the media, means that I just assumed that anyone who'd spent their whole life like defending the people that everyone else was enraged by because they'd said something terrible wouldn't be such a nice guy. David French is clearly thoughtful and open. I had this interview with him. I've encountered him in a few other settings. And as far as I can tell, there is no disagreement about that. No matter how deeply you disagree with David French, there's no disagreement that he's a lovely guy genuinely trying to be civil and thoughtful in public. So that was a good scolding to my two-dimensional stereotypes. He talked about his childhood in the church as being around a lot of people who are very judgmental and intolerant, a whole church culture that was judgmental and intolerant. And it's always good for me to hear those stories because that's just been not my experience at all. I was only raised in church in the very loosest sort of British cultural Christianity sense. And it was not that. It was really not that. So, helpful to hear those stories and the mark that's left. Right. He said this thing about, he's basically always been a conservative because of the Cold War. And again, so helpful to understand, because the idea that conservatism is this kind of virtuous bulwark against the ravages of a dehumanizing, tyrannical and brutal Soviet communism is not part of my generation's sort of social imaginary. That's a very jargony term. Basically, I was too young during the Cold War. My generation were too young for people who became conservative to have that really, I think, as part of their reasons. But for a whole generation coming through, I saw this in Peter Hitchens as well. It was a fundamental reason. Conservatism is the antidote to a kind of painfully, at its best, painfully naive utopian attempt to make human beings into what they're not, and thereby sort of accidentally create a tyrannous, controlling horror show. And that basically I think the argument is that conservative better understands how human nature works and how we should set up society to flourish, and that freedom, like individual freedom against the tyrannical overreach of the state, is fundamental to a good life and human flourishing. So it's a piece of the puzzle when we're trying to listen and understand how people get to where they get to. And people can get to the same political tribe or the same principal position from very different routes, right? Or vote for the same party for very different reasons. And we come with a lot of assumptions, and it's really helpful to unpack those. Free speech is the dread of tyrants. It actually was an immensely helpful conversation for me about free speech. And obviously that Frederick Douglass source of I recently visited where Frederick Douglass grew up, like an enslaved man who freed themselves and then went on to become such a kind of civic powerhouse in the abolitionist movement. And to hear David French basically say, yes, there are costs to allowing certain kind of speech in public, and some people will bear more of those costs. And it's unavoidable, and the alternative is worse, basically. The alternative of constraining free speech creates more harm in the long term. Helpful clarity. Iraq. Wow. Can't you just hear how David became this darling of the right? You know, he speaks with so much passion about being a patriot and kind of sacrificing his love of his wife and his children to go be the kind of in-house lawyer for a armed unit in Iraq. And that, that when you're thinking about like deep driving values that drive our behavior, it's really helpful to hear the beauty of that vision in his eyes. It was interesting to me when I said, have you got any regrets? And he said, absolutely no. And I wish I'd probed in terms of there's many layers of that, right? Like his own experience and what he felt able to offer, and then how it shaped him is one thing. And then there's the kind of my understanding of what the way history has judged that war and the lasting impacts of it and the moral complexity around that. I wish we'd dug into that bit, and I didn't. And then we got to what he's perhaps now best known for in America, this kind of sense of being cancelled by the church is the shorthand, that he has been expelled from many evangelical circles and many conservative circles. And so is his wife, who was like a speechwriter and a ghostwriter for many of the kind of greats of the last 20 years of the Republican Party, for daring to question President Trump. And I can hear it in him and in David Brooks and a few other kind of prominent conservatives who are anti-Trump, who really have this kind of wow, I thought we were this, and in fact we're that. Like the losing faith in America, which must be immensely painful if that is such a deep part of your belonging and your identity. Losing faith in the church's ability to form virtuous citizens, right, who can care about someone else's interests other than their own. And the cost of that, the courage required. In some ways, I can see how, having been a litigator, right, having been the person prepared to defend free speech even when other people thought it was indefensible, has helped him build the muscle to then be still an evangelical, still a conservative, and saying this is a deeply, deeply wrong move for our country and for the church. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Sacred. My name is Elizabeth Oldfield, and The Sacred is a project of the think tank Theos. Please come check out our wider work. Amazing, amazing research projects and events, sister podcasts, animations being made by the team all the time. Our production team are Lydia Taylor, Amari Gandron, Lizzie Harvey, and we are edited by Drew Hawley. Our music is by Luke Stanley, and I look forward to speaking to you next time.